A long time ago, in a field not so far away, long before the 4th of May was Star Wars Day, it was remembered for another reason. The 4th of May 1471 saw the Battle of Tewkesbury, the second battle that year that would restore the House of York to the throne of England and play a defining role in the future of the kingdom. Today, the 4th of May 2021 marks the 550th anniversary of that battle. So let's have a quick look at who was there, why they were fighting, how the day played out, and how it set the course of English history. Let's take a look at the Battle of Tewkesbury. You might recall that the 14th of April had seen the Battle of Barnet, at which King Edward had returned from his exile and defeated his cousin, the Earl of Warwick, who had been killed in the fighting. It was only 10 days after this, shortly after he got back into London, that Edward ordered another muster at Windsor Castle. This was because the last Lancastrian threat to his throne, Queen Margaret of Anjou and her 17-year-old son, Edward, Prince of Wales, had landed on the south coast on the same day as the Battle of Barnet and were seeking to challenge Edward for his crown. This would be the big showdown between York and Lancaster. Edward mustered all the fresh troops he could gather at Windsor Castle on the 24th of April. He was joined there by his littlest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who you may recall was injured at the Battle of Barnet, though we don't know how badly or precisely how he was injured. Clearly he was well enough to take part in the forthcoming battle against the remainder of the Lancastrian forces. They marched out from Windsor Castle, and by the 27th of April they were at Abingdon, where they spent 2 days gathering information on where the Lancastrian army was. By the 29th of April they'd moved on to Cirencester, and it was here that word reached them that Margaret of Anjou planned to be in Bath the following day and to offer battle the day after that, the 1st of May. And so on the 1st of May, Edward prepared his army for a fight. He marched out of Cirencester in battle array to look for Margaret of Anjou. He waited about 3 miles outside of Cirencester, but saw no sign, so he moved forward to Malmesbury to seek her out. But still he couldn't see any sign of the Lancastrian Queen's army. And then the news arrived that Edward had been tricked. Margaret never meant to give battle at Cirencester at all. She'd slipped past Bath, headed on to Bristol, and was now moving north along the Welsh border, hoping to cross the River Severn and join up with Lancastrian reinforcements under Jasper Tudor, the Earl of Pembroke. Edward knew that he needed to stop this from happening somehow. And so he gave chase. He pursued them up north along the Welsh border, desperately trying to catch up with them before they could take this battle beyond his means. On the 2nd of May, Edward got word that Margaret planned to give battle again at Sodbury. And indeed, when Edward's scouts arrived there, they found some of Margaret of Anjou's outriders and there was a skirmish. Edward heard the news and rushed to Sodbury to give battle, only to find that Margaret wasn't there again. She tricked him yet again, and she was ploughing on north, desperately trying to cross the River Severn. By the end of the 2nd of May, Edward knew that Margaret was 15 miles north of him at Barclay. He pressed on after her, but Margaret continued her hard march north. On the 3rd of May, she'd reached Gloucester, another 15 miles further on. She tried to force a crossing of the river there, but the town was held against her. The gates were kept shut, and they refused to let her cross. Their only option was to press on further north to the next crossing at Tewkesbury. The problem for Margaret's increasingly tired army was that Tewkesbury was another 10 miles march north. And by now they would have known that the Yorkists were hot on their heels. They arrived at Tewkesbury as the light began to fade on the 3rd of May and made their camp. They were left with a fairly stark choice. They could try and cross the river, but that would involve splitting their forces and making a risky crossing, either in the dark or in the daylight in the early morning, when the Yorkist army would be right upon them. Or they could stay and fight, and take the risk. They probably felt by this point that they had no real choice. They were going to have to fight Edward at some point, and better to fight him as a whole army than to divide their forces and risk being cut apart as they tried to cross the river. And so they settled in for an easy night's sleep, preparing for the battle that they knew was certain to come the next morning. For Edward's part, he'd made his men undergo a forced march of fully 30 miles to catch up with Margaret's Lancastrian army. They marched in full armour all day long in weather that the source known as the Arrival describes as unusually and unseasonably hot. But they arrived just outside Tewkesbury as night fell on the 3rd of May and pitched their camp. I'm filming this on the 3rd of May 2021, and I can assure you the weather is nothing like as blisteringly hot and dry as the Arrival told us it was in 1471. When they all got up on the 4th of May, everybody knew that a battle was imminent and unavoidable. Some pretty big decisions had to be made about what was going to happen, and they would define the course of the remainder of the 15th century. One of the biggest, hardest and most significant decisions that was taken that day was taken by Queen Margaret. She decided to allow her 17-year-old son, Edward, Prince of Wales, to take part in the battle. It must have been a difficult choice for a mother of a young son. It would be his first taste of battle. Margaret wasn't allowed to be at the battlefield. She was forced to withdraw and wait for news of the result. It's hard to imagine the worry that she must have gone through knowing her son was there. She maybe felt like she had little option. His grandfather had been the warrior King Henry V, but his dad's inability to lead an army, unwillingness to take those kind of risks, was what had led to the Wars of the Roses and their family being kicked off the throne. This was a chance to redefine Lancaster and take back the initiative. But at what risk? As Margaret sat and waited for news of the battle that she must have known would start with the early morning light, she can surely only have prayed, and she would have known that this was a day that would either remake Lancaster or destroy it forever. The vanguard, the front of the Lancastrian army, was led by Edmund Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset. Prince Edward was fighting in the centre, which was led by Lord Wenlock, who was a former ally of the Earl of Warwick. The rearguard was held by the Earl of Devon, and for Edward's part, he took his own centre again, as he had at Barnet, along with his brother George, still perhaps not trusted to be given command of his own. His youngest brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was given the vanguard, as he had been at Barnet, again, after his strong performance, clearly trusted to take a leading role at Tewkesbury. And the rearguard was given to Lord Hastings. Hastings was perhaps not quite trusted to face Somerset, after it was his forces who had fled at Barnet and put the battle at risk for a long time in the face of the Earl of Oxford's men. Edward, as was his custom, ordered a blast of trumpets to begin the battle, and his cannon opened fire. Somerset's men had taken up a high position on a ridge amongst thickets of brambles, but they had far less guns than the Yorkist king did, and they knew that they couldn't resist this for too long. They couldn't sit there and simply be pounded by the Yorkist cannons and cut to pieces by the arrows that fell down on them. And so Somerset faithfully took the initiative. He saw Richard's vanguard approaching him, and he decided to move through the thickets that they'd found the night before. They must have found a path, a safe way through these. And he moved round to try and flank Edward's centre, thinking that directly attacking the Yorkist king was their surest chance of victory. But this is where one of those moments that it's hard to tell whether this was Edward's brilliance as a general and a battlefield tactician, or the kind of luck that any man would need to survive and win on a medieval battlefield. Because as Somerset wheeled round and set out to flank Edward's centre. 200 footmen that Edward hadn't really known what to do with, so he'd stuck them in a wood at the side of the battlefield and ordered them to keep an eye out for an ambush and do anything they thought was useful. Well, they spotted Somerset coming, and they were able to attack his men from the rear as he moved towards Edward's centre. They were thrown into panic. They were pushed back towards Richard's vanguard, which were now returning to look for Somerset. Somerset's men broke and panicked. Many of them tried to cross the river and were drowned in their armour, trampled to death as they tried to flee. Others made it to what they assumed was the safety of the abbey. The fighting in the centre remained hard and close fought. The Crowland chronicler describes how the result had long remained doubtful. But eventually it was Edward's men who won out. Prince Edward, the 17-year-old heir to the House of Lancaster, was killed, probably during the fighting. There are stories that he was stabbed after the battle had ended, while he tried to surrender and seek mercy. But other sources seem to suggest that he was cut down as part of the fighting that went on in the centre. Edward made his way to the abbey, where as many as could make it there had taken refuge. Apparently he burst into the door only to be chastised by a very brave monk who told him off for coming into the abbey in full armour with his sword drawn, no doubt covered in the sweat and blood of battle still, roaring and demanding that the prisoners inside be handed over. The monk stood his ground against the 6'4", battle-hardened warrior king, and indeed demanded a pardon for Somerset and all those that were with him, which Edward apparently agreed to, only to go against it and order all of those men to be dragged out of the abbey to face his justice. A court of chivalry was convened, a court-martial, under the king's youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who was Constable of England. The men were all tried, sentenced to death, and on the 6th of May, 2 days after the battle, all of them, including Edmund Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset, the last male heir of the House of Beaufort, were executed in Tewkesbury. As you'd no doubt expect from me, I'm here to make this a little bit more about Richard, Duke of Gloucester. There was a contemporary poem that was written to celebrate the victory at Tewkesbury, and it compared Richard, Duke of Gloucester to Hector, the Trojan hero. And of all the people named, he's the only one to be compared to any of these great Greek mythological heroes. Hector was famously the greatest warrior in Troy, and he died protecting his family. He was fiercely loyal to all of his family and to protecting the crown. And clearly that's what contemporaries saw in Richard this early on in his career. It's 1471. He's 18 years old. This is only his second taste of battle, and already he's being described as Hector, not just a great warrior, but a loyal person, a man who is supporting his family and protecting them against all comers. The poem also talks about Richard having been selected by Lady Fortune to be her husband. And so clearly his contemporaries thought that he was both brave and lucky. It's hard to see what could possibly go wrong. This could have marked an end to the Wars of the Roses. Lancaster was all but finished and very soon would be completely extinguished. This was the last time, really, that York and Lancaster would fight each other for the crown of England, and York had won and Lancaster had been destroyed once and for all. But as with everything else in the Wars of the Roses, nothing is quite that simple. In Edward's absence, London had been under siege from a man known as the Bastard of Fauconberg, an illegitimate son of William Neville, the Earl of Kent, and a cousin of the Earl of Warwick. He was a famous soldier and sailor and pirate, not unlike his cousin the Earl of Warwick. London had managed to hold out, but as Edward got back to his capital city, it was pretty clear that although he dealt with Lancaster, there were still petals to be plucked in the Wars of the Roses. There was work to be done in Yorkist England still.